Hi everybody and welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your host James and I'm delighted to be talking to a new guest today, Mr. David Hatcher Childress, known as the real-life Indiana Jones to many of his fans and a captivating speaker in his own right, author and co-author of over 20 books. And he's travelled the world several times over, seeking adventure and the answers to the mysteries of mankind's pasts. You can read about David on his website, davidhatcherchildress.com. David's also a publisher of many of this genre of books. A lot of alternative historian authors are published with David, and you can catch that at Adventures Unlimited Press. And he also has the World Explorers magazine, I believe. Today we're going to talk about his latest book, Vimana, Flying Machine of the Ancients, and a little bit about the book before I bring David on. According to early Sanskrit texts, the ancients had several types of airships called Vimanas. Like the aircraft of today, Vimanas used to fly through the air from city to city to conduct aerial surveys of uncharted lands and as delivery vehicles for awesome weapons. David Hatcher Childress, popular Lost Cities author and star of the History Channel's long-running show Ancient Aliens, takes us on an astounding investigation into the tales of ancient flying machines. And if that wasn't big enough intro, let's bring on our day's guest. Hi David, welcome to Capricorn Radio.
Hey James, good to be on your show.
David, nice to have you here, and wow, what an enigmatic author you are, David. I guess that to call you a mystery seeker would be an understatement, David. You've tapped into so many of the mysteries and went in pursuit of them. A lot of authors do, they don't have the time that you have spent in the field, David. You really have traveled the world several times over. Tell us a little bit about that part of your life, David. I guess that's a core component of what you do. You like to get out there and research this stuff in the field yourself.
Yeah, I love to travel, and I love archaeology and going to different places, mysterious places, megalithic cities, and I've always been interested in the unknown and mysteries of the past, Atlantis and UFOs, psychic phenomenon, levitation, underwater, structures and other things like that. I was born in France actually, but my parents are American, and I lived in France till I was like 3, and then my family moved back to the United States, and I grew up in the mountains of Colorado, really, and my father was a real outdoorsy guy, loved to go camping, and we went skiing and stuff and hiking. And my parents liked to travel too, which was good. So when I was younger, went to England and Stonehenge, went down to Mexico and climbed the pyramids there. And in the United States, there was a cartoon show that was very popular in the 60s called Johnny Quest, where Johnny and his pals ran around the world and searched for mysteries, and I got a good dose of those as a kid. But I really wanted to go mountain climbing. I was a technical climber when I was younger, and so I had a dual interest of wanting to go to Tibet and the Himalayas, and because I was interested and fascinated by Tibet and the mysteries of things there, but also I actually wanted to climb in the Himalayas, and I did that. Although I gave up technical climbing after a while and just began traveling all over the world. I felt I was fortunate I traveled through India and Afghanistan, even and Iran back in the mid 70s.
Wow.
Then I went to Africa, and I ended up getting a job in Sudan, as a matter of fact. And for years, I was just sort of a $5 a day traveler with backpack and staying in youth hostels, and I would get jobs where I could. Ultimately, in the end, I returned to the United States after being gone for over 5 years in Asia and Africa, and then I began going to South America and Central America, and ultimately I wrote my early series of books called the Lost Cities series. Yeah.
Wow.
And those books are regional. There's one, and they were published in the 80s and the 90s. Lost Cities and Ancient Mysteries of South America. There's one about Lost Cities, Ancient Mysteries of Africa and Arabia, one on Asia, one on Pacific Islands, and ultimately my last book in the Lost Cities series was about Lost Cities and Ancient Mysteries of the American Southwest and parts of Mexico, which is where I live today. I live in Arizona.
Beautiful part of the world, David. Beautiful part of the world. I think what I like about your work, David, is you're one of the first people to talk about Nan Madol and bring it. You did a lot of press for that, David. Tell us a little bit about Nan Madol, because not a lot of people have ventured there. It's a very, very remote place, full of mystery, incredibly megalithic construction, really vast place in terms of engineering feat. Tell us a little bit about Nan Madol, and I think that's the one thing that put me on the compass towards David Hatcher Childress.
Nan Madol is the eighth wonder of the world. And most people haven't heard of it, and it is it's a remote island, and it's difficult to get to. It's on the island of Pohnpei, which is today the capital of the Federated States of Micronesia. To get there, you have to fly from Hawaii or Guam, and then you get to this relatively small, although for Micronesia it's a pretty big island. It's a mountainous island, and on the what is the southeast side of the island, and in fact it's actually built into the ocean, is the city of Nan Madol, which is a city that consists of approximately 100 artificial islands that are built up with huge basalt logs, crystalline basalt, similar to what you have there at the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, we have the exact same basalt columns, a very mysterious looking rock formation. But yeah, please continue.
Basalt is extremely hard, but it will, as it cools, it crystallizes into, or it can anyway, into these like 8-sided sort of crystalline logs, and they can be split off from cliffs, and they become what is almost like a pre-dressed stone, because it's got smooth sides and angles. And then what you can do with these logs, which can weigh up to 50 tons or more, 80 tons even. Most of them probably weigh 2 to 5 tons or so. And they're magnetic. Basalt's extremely hard, but then you can stack them up in what we call in the United States a Lincoln log fashion, like kind of building a log cabin.
Sure.
Only you're doing it with these long, heavy, and very hard basalt kind of logs, in a sense. And that is what Nan Madol is made of. And in fact, archaeologists estimate that there's over 200 million tons of basalt that's built up into huge walls. Some of the walls are 20 to 30 feet high. Much of the city is underwater. The city itself is not even built on the land of the island. It's built onto a coral reef that's on the southeast side of the island. Wow. The natives say that the basalt at Nan Madol was magically flown through the air by these two magicians who were brothers, and they came to the island, identified that they wanted to build this city, and then began dismantling an entire mountain it would be. And in fact, archaeologists don't really know where all this basalt came from to build Nan Madol. Over 200 million tons of basalt. It's such an astounding amount.
The Great Pyramid,
of
David,
rock.
The Great Pyramid is what, 6 million tons, something like that?
Sorry, what's that?
The Great Pyramid, 6 million tons, I believe, something like that.
Is that right? Okay. That may well be. Yeah, when you go to see the Great Pyramid, and I know you've been there, yeah, you're standing there looking at what looks like a giant man-made mountain of rock. And yeah, it would have like 6 million tons or something in it.
Wow.
Nan Madol is more material.
Wow.
And where it came from, I mean, they don't know. I mean, an entire mountain would be dismantled to provide that much rock. It's bizarre. Much of the city's underwater. You have to wear a mask and a snorkel or even scuba diving gear to go down and see this city.
Wow.
You have to go by boat through the city. It's like this massive port. There's another similar city on another island that's just west, actually just east of Pohnpei, an island called Koh Chai.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that also has a smaller basalt city called Lelu.
Wow.
It's one of the most astonishing things, and it's mainstream archaeologists don't have a good explanation for it.
What about the locals, David? Don't they have it's a no-go area for the locals, I hear. Is that rumor?
Well, they have a lot of superstitions about the city. They believe that they'll die if they spend the night there.
Wow.
There are people who live relatively near it, and I was just there in February, actually, this year, and you know, there is a family there, and they charge a fee to then go on into this area where the city is. And again, you have to, the parts of it you can walk through or wade through these canals. Other parts you have to be in a boat. Yeah, so the natives themselves don't like going there. Though as a kids, they'll probably go as a field trip with a school or something. But they have all kinds of superstitions. They believe that there are these lights that move through the city at night. And one of the strange things about this Namdal is that it's a magnetic city. Basalt is magnetic. And if you take a compass and you run it along some of the walls there, your compass will just start spinning.
Wow.
Wildly.
I wonder.
And again, the natives have this whole belief that the stones were levitated and flown through the air, and they're so heavy and there's so much of it, you have to really, I think, believe it, that these stones had to be levitated, some kind of anti-gravity, magnetic levitation, I don't know. And then they're just moving these things through the air, making them weightless, and then stacking them up in these huge walls. I can tell you right now, even on that island today, where they have cranes and heavy equipment and stuff, and there's a port on the other side of the island, but even, I mean, it couldn't make that city. And then, of course, archaeologists are saying that these relatively, primitive islanders with like a little catamaran or something like that had somehow quarried, split off all these basalt logs, and then somehow moved them from like the other side of the island or something on boats, they say, brought them to the southeast part of the island, and then stacked them up into walls 30 feet high. And they had to actually create artificial islands first. It's like the amount of work and construction is mind-blowing. When you're there, you're completely baffled.
Wow.
I mean, and that's why I think people like Eric von Däniken, he went there in the early 70s and talked about it in his fourth book, Stones of Kiribati. And of course, he's saying that, yeah, aliens, had to come and make this city. And when you see it, you're baffled as to how anyone could have made it without some kind of literally magical powers.
Sure. There's so many mysteries on this planet, David. I know you've looked into several, but there are certain types of places, Namdal, for example, you must really give consideration to us getting help somehow. I guess that lends us to the book, David, Vimana. When you read about Vimanas, I mean, this stuff reads like science fiction, but it's in the historical record. Tell us the premise for the book, David. This is a new area for you. I know you've spoke about Vimanas before, but you've put a wealth of information in the book, Vimana, Flying Machines of the Ancients. Let's give us a little bit of background for the book, David.
Well, sure. Actually, that's my second book on Vimanas that I wrote. And to me, it's a subject that I find fascinating. when you read like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, these Indian epics, they do read like the wildest science fiction. They're flying around in these airships. They're called Vimanas. They have different types of Vimanas. These airships have weapons. They are machines. People get in and out of them just like a chariot or something like that. The whole story of the Ramayana features Vimanas quite a bit, and it's the story of a married couple, Rama and his wife Sita. She is, according to the story, she's kidnapped by a guy in an island nation called Lanka, and because he's in love with her too, and he takes her off in his Vimana, and he flies her to Lanka, where he's the king, and he's a powerful king and whatnot, and has a big empire. Rama is bummed out that his wife has left him in a sense, although, and then he finds out, well, she's actually been kidnapped. So he gets his friends together and his brothers, and Hanuman is the sort of monkey king buddy of his who loves Rama, is going to help him. But they do things where they go to Lanka and they essentially siege Lanka and they fight a big battle. But the battle is also fought with these Vimanas, and there's aerial battles. They're flying around. They're destroying each other. They have various types of weapons, and I describe all these in the book on Vimana. And I think what's so fascinating about the whole subject of Vimanas is that for Hindus and Buddhists in Asia, and there's literally a billion of these people, they all know this story, and they all know about Vimanas. It's not some weird esoteric thing to them, and they completely accept that Rama was a real person,
really?
And that they had these airships called Vimanas. It's just it's part of their history, they think.
Wow. I believe there was different types of Vimanas. Maybe you could expand on that, David.
Well, one of the things about ancient India especially, one of our problems as archaeologists and historians is trying to piece together the past.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And basically, the past has been, and history's been destroyed. Entire libraries completely wiped out, like the Library of Alexandria in Egypt, where, there were hundreds of thousands of books there, and they were all destroyed and burned. The Emperor Qi of China, he also ordered all books in China destroyed at one point. The Spanish, when they conquered Mexico and Central America, they also destroyed all of these Mayan codexes. Only 4 are known to survive today. But India is different. India is sort of the one culture that where the past and the books haven't been destroyed. People can still read these books. They have many libraries in India. And so we have a wealth of ancient material and manuscripts that we can look at in regards to Vimanas. And they describe some of the books in India, and they actually talk about some of the technology behind the Vimanas. And one of the curious things that they mention is the use of mercury.
Wow.
And really, to have flight, you're going to need some kind of engines and motors. You really need electricity. And apparently, their Vimanas would have had all that stuff. They had to have a pretty high technology. But curiously, they're talking about mercury as part of the workings of these Vimanas. Some of the Vimanas apparently were flying saucer type craft. They were discoid. They took off. They flew. They even crystals and electricity were part of it. And it's interesting too with the whole Vimana Mercury kind of connection is what goes back to World War II. And at the end of World War II, there was a phenomenon that started happening over Germany with the American and British bombers, and that was what they call Foo Fighters. And so these Foo Fighters were these balls of these flying globes, and they were smaller than, say, a flying saucer. They were maybe the size of a large ball, maybe the size of a table or something like that. They were glowing. They would fly, and they would be in swarms over Germany. And the British and Americans got photos of these things too, and news articles began appearing in the newspapers right at the end of the war about the Germans having a new secret weapon, and they called them Foo Fighters.
Wow.
So you've heard of Foo Fighters before,
sure,
right?
Yeah, the Foo Fighters story, I think Winston Churchill put a ban on anybody talking about the Foo Fighters story for 50 years. At least the details of it, because in World War II, when the Foo Fighters were about, I think there was a lot of, worry about if the story got out, but it's kind of out now. I actually think about what Bob Lazar said about Area 51. He talked about some Mercury-type material powering the UFO craft at Area 51. Well, he said that Mercury-type material was like Mercury, but it was element 115. And was not known to man.
Right, and Bob Lazar's story is a little, I think it's questionable, and it's interesting that he is talking about this in anti-gravity and how at Area 51, where he says he worked, that they were retro-engineering these alien craft, and by the way, that city that's at Area 51, and you can reach it from Las Vegas just in less than an hour. It's called Mercury.
Wow.
Okay, that's the town, and you can't go there because you have to have a security clearance, but you can see it from the highway, and there's a sign on the interstate. It says, Mercury, Nevada, but it's a military installation and a town, and it's named Mercury.
Wow.
Mercury was the ancient Greek god he was the messenger god. He was the god of flight. He flies through the air, and it all has to do with Mercury. Mercury is a special element, and Mercury is an element. It's a metal. It's also a liquid. It's a conductor. What you can do with Mercury is create what's called a plasma, and a plasma is an electrified gas. And so you have what are called mercury vapor lamps, something similar like neon lighting. It's also a plasma. So you've got a gas and an element, and then you electrify it, and you can do all this with mercury, but there's something else you can do with mercury. You can create a gyro out of mercury, and it has to be inside of a closed system. Mercury gas and vapor is deadly poisonous. But like, for instance, a glass sphere, and then imagine the mercury then moving as a gyro. Think of a toy gyro and gyros themselves have anti-gravity effects. And what gyros do, gyros are special as well. And they're part of, and times they're secret parts of even ships and planes and things like that. But a mercury gyro apparently gives an anti-gravity type of lift, and it's electric. Mercury is an important part, and so the mercury is swirling around inside the gyro, and then when you electrify it, it becomes what is like a Foo Fighter. And the Foo Fighters themselves were apparently, but the military still keeps them a secret. They were these like glass balls. They had mercury inside them. They became these gyros. They have to have electrical devices and even pulsing ignition switches and things like that. And then these things fly. What Foo Fighters were apparently used for, and they were made by the Germans at the end of World War II, rather than by, say, extraterrestrials, in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Although many UFO investigators still seem to think that Foo Fighters weren't German and they weren't British or American either, that they were somehow little alien ships that were there, watching the end of the war or something. But the best explanation that has been given, and I co-authored a book called Man-Made UFOs about 20 years ago, and Foo Fighters are discussed in that book.
Mm-hmm.
What they did is similar to the phenomenon that's well known in UFO circles, where let's say a flying saucer suddenly is hovering over your car, and your car will not work. The electric system in your car is interfered with, and that's it's a well-known effect in UFO lore of your car won't work while there's a UFO around.
Wow.
And it's because the pulsing and the strong electromagnetic fields from the UFO are interfering with the electrical system of your car. The Foo Fighters were doing a similar thing. They released hundreds of them into the skies over Germany, and then bombers would have to fly through these swarms of Foo Fighters. And what would happen is the engines in the bombers would start missing, and some of the engines would actually cut out and stop working. And what the bombers would do then was drop their bombs on a farmer's field in Germany instead of on Dresden or Berlin, and return to their bases in Britain.
Wow.
So what the Foo Fighters were doing was trying to basically stop the bombers, from completing their missions.
Fascinating.
And they had some success at it, but in the end, it failed.
Fascinating time period in history too. I believe the Nazis, the Germans, were looking into ancient Indian texts as well, David, on these Vimanas. I think these guys were researching this stuff as if it was true. They were researching it for any type of scientific concepts they could gain from it.
Well, that's right. And just like in the Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they talk about the Nazis being, totally immersed in the occult. Mm-hmm. They believed in Atlantis. They believed in Vimanas and ancient civilizations. They believed in weird ancient technology. In many ways, they were ahead of their time. And
sure.
Even today, both Germany and Japan, as nations, they're very much steeped in esoteric things. As a nation, they tend to believe, Japanese are like this too, they tend to believe in extraterrestrials and aliens and super civilizations of the ancient past. And that's what I believe in as well.
Sure. I know you've looked into the hollow earth theory as well, David. Do you think perhaps the Germans had Vimanas engineered, or they escaped to Antarctica or secret bases?
Well, right. And I think that in some ways the hollow earth theory and the books that were written in the 60s by Bernard, and I've republished one of those books with some commentary and stuff. A lot of it has to do with Antarctica and the Germans going there, and then, of course, the idea that there's, in the hollow earth theories, that there's holes at the poles and you can go inside the earth. And what happened was, at the end of World War II, there were many of the Nazi hierarchy, they vanished, and even Hitler himself was thought to have escaped. And the way that they were able to escape was by using some of the U-boats that they had. Supposedly the Germans had over 100 what they call the black U-boats, U-boats that weren't registered and were officially logged, shall we say, with the Third Reich. So they had all these secret submarines. They had other airplanes. Even the Germans at the end of World War II had all these captured British and American planes. They had a whole airfield outside Berlin of British and American planes, so they could actually literally fly out of Germany to Switzerland or Spain or something, in a British plane or an American one.
Wow.
But then they would still have to get to ultimately South America, and Indonesia is where a lot of these people went. But the Germans at some point built some secret base in Antarctica. They had one in the Canary Islands too. There was apparently one in Greenland, and they were these super submarine type bases. The Germans had started building the one in Antarctica even before World War II, apparently.
Wow.
So at the end of the war, they were able to go to some of these hidden areas, and Antarctica became, in a sense, apparently, became really the last bastion of the Third Reich. They had aircraft and submarines there. Some authors think that they had actually flying saucers at that point, that they had begun making them towards the end of the war. And so then you have the weird statements by Admiral Byrd. See, in 1947, the U.S. Navy sent Admiral Byrd an entire flotilla, including 2 aircraft carriers and destroyers, and they had helicopters and fighter jets. And they went to Antarctica. They went to the area of Antarctica that's opposite South Africa, which is known as Queen Maud Land. And it was that area that the Germans supposedly had this secret base. And that's where in 1947, this Navy flotilla that was commanded by Admiral Byrd went. But what happened was they were going to supposedly go there and be there for a year, but they came back after a month, and apparently they literally had some kind of battle in Antarctica, and the American Navy was defeated. And then Byrd started making all of these strange comments about flying saucers. He said that they had this new craft that could fly from pole to pole, is what Byrd said.
Wow. And
Byrd started making all these oddball statements, and he then, on the way back to the United States, they stopped in Chile, where Byrd also made oddball statements to the press. Those statements got into newspapers in Chile and Argentina. But when Byrd finally returned to the United States, and he was an admiral and in charge of this entire expedition, he was basically relieved of command, and he was put into a mental hospital.
Really?
And he basically spent the final years of his life in a mental hospital. Wow. Where everyone said, he's crazy, because he babbled on about flying saucers, about Germans, weird stuff in Antarctica. And a lot of people started claiming that he had gone into the hollow earth, actually, and that's what had made him crazy, and that's why, and that they were really trying to suppress him, and just shut him up, really, because he wouldn't stop talking about all this stuff.
Admiral Byrd.
But so the reality may be that the hollow earth story is more of a cover-up for these Antarctic bases that the Germans had during and after World War II.
What an incredible story Admiral Byrd is. The more research into it, the more you look at it, and the more you look at the things he said and the snippets of circumstantial evidence, it makes sense, especially for the time period and the Nazis maybe having Vimanas. David, I'm looking at your book here, Vimana, Flying Machines of the Ancients. There's these wonderful conceptual drawings of Vimanas. Let's tell us a little bit about these, because I believe these have been reconstructed from the text.
Well, right. Some of those pictures in there were drawn in 1923 by these Indian scholars and Sanskrit scholars who were going over this other text, which was called Vimānika Shastra. And this was a text that was supposedly found in the Royal Baroda Library in central India, and was a manual for Vimanas. I mean, that's one of the things as you read about Vimanas in the many Indian texts that talk about them, Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and many others. But they'll talk about Vimanas and sometimes give some technical details, but you don't really get a good idea of exactly how these things work. Very similar to reading a a novel or something where the hero suddenly gets on an airplane and flies someplace and goes someplace. You know, the author doesn't suddenly stop and tell you exactly what an airplane is and how it works and, you know, what fuel it uses. The author of a book knows that you know what an airplane is. So they just have to mention it and talk about it. So we didn't have any really detailed texts that were really technical about Vimanas. But then this one text was discovered, the Vimana Shastra text.
Sure.
Although and this was a text that was all about the technical part of these Vimanas. It's difficult reading, trying to make sense out of the Vimana Shastra text is tough. I try and do it in the book. It talks about crystals and electricity. It talks about mercury. It talks about different types of craft. One type of Vimana looked apparently like an airplane and had wings and things. Another type of Vimana looked more like a zeppelin or a cigar-type ship. So it was a long cylindrical craft. Another type of Vimana was apparently a circular flying saucer-type craft. I mean, the whole thing is pretty interesting. I mean, what I surmise in the Vimana book is that, yeah, what they had was flight that was very similar to ours today, winged craft. Probably these craft were more electric. They were more like what we would call Tesla technology. And, you know, that's one of the things, too, today with NASA and even like, say, Bob Lazar, who you mentioned earlier.
Sure.
Where it's like the technology that we supposedly have to go into space and go to the moon or whatever, Mars, is going to be rockets. And, you know, it's exploding a giant firecracker under your ass and going into space.
It's primitive.
But it's very primitive. I mean, and the idea, if Nikola Tesla was alive, the idea that, yeah, that aliens would go through space in rockets, that we would go through space in rockets, that's just not how time travel or space travel would really be like. It's going to be electric. It's going to be anti-gravity. It's going to be creating special fields around the craft. Your own craft would have like a special force field that you create, like your own Van Allen belt in a sense as you fly through space. So in some ways, it would seem, and that's like with Foo Fighters being still a military secret after all these years. You know, why would that be? You know, what is the technology of Foo Fighters that they need to keep a secret? Well, they're electric. They don't burn you know, gallons of fuel. They don't have some chemical explosion that's part of, you know, their thrust. Their thrust, what the controls of a flying saucer are like, would look like a recording studio or something with all of these amplifiers and boards and mixing boards and mixing your field. Back to Bob Lazar. You know what? I mean, one of the problems I would have with Bob Lazar, aside from the fact that he knows all these secrets and is able to tell them without anybody even batting an eye, the military doesn't seem to care that he's out there talking about all the secret stuff he did. But one of his whole point of element 115, of this other element, and that, to me that was a fascinating part of his argument. But there's a problem with that in what he's saying. And what Bob Lazar is basically saying is that element 115 can't come from our solar system. It has to come, he said, from a double star system. And it had, like Zeta Reticuli or something. So the interesting part that Bob Lazar was making was that anti-gravity exists to power flying saucers, but we can never make it on Earth. No. It has to come from another solar system. So what Bob Lazar was essentially saying was, we can never make a flying saucer. No. Aliens can, because they've got element 115 from a double star system, but we can never make them ourselves. And that is what's completely wrong.
Yeah.
And if Bob Lazar is a misinformation or a disinformation person, which I think he is, yeah, his message is, yeah, anti-gravity exists, flying saucers exist, but only aliens will ever be able to make it.
Strange story.
And that's his story.
Sure, I agree. Strange story about Bob Lazar. It's interesting that some of it rings true and then maybe some of it doesn't. I think there's probably some truth in there, a core body of truth, but a lot of misinformation too.
Well, I think that they are making flying saucers, and they do have anti-gravity. And Bob Lazar says that he sat there in his lab and they would throw cans or something at this thing, this ball, and they would bounce off and go up to the ceiling like it was this anti-gravity element, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So here, by seeing it that way, if you can get what I'm saying.
Sure.
So in other words, the Germans had anti-gravity during World War II. They made Foo Fighters. They even began making flying saucers. The Russians and the Americans and the British would have gotten all this technology. The Germans had it. Now they have it too. It's been 60 years that they've had to work on all this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They keep it top secret. Many of the top politicians in America and power brokers, they work for oil companies.
Mm-hmm.
Dick Cheney is famous that way. He's an oil company guy. And oil companies basically run the world. And the entire world's economy today has to do with oil. The production of oil, the use of oil, burning gas in our gas tanks. Right now, the Russian economy is completely tanking. And it's all because the price of oil has gone down.
Oh, for sure.
Their economy too is completely based on oil.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a problem. If oil was suddenly obsolete and we didn't, and particularly for space exploration and stuff like that, then everything would suddenly change. And that's why say the military would, and the U.S. government and whatnot, they have good reasons for keeping this technology a secret, or they think there are good reasons.
For sure.
I'm convinced that, as Bob Lazar says, they've got this stuff, but it doesn't have to come from another solar system. It's actually just basic physics and what we would call plasma physics here on Earth. And now back to Vimanas. That's what the Vimanas is all about. It's Mercury is the power source, and by electrifying Mercury, there's other Mercury drives too. There's a Mercury ion drive. But there's something special about Mercury, and the Vimanas, talk about that. And as I said, when Bob Lazar went to work at Area 51, he would, clock in Mercury, Nevada.
David, I got to mention megaliths now because I want to actually get into a little, just before the end of the show, I want to get into the Peru and Bolivia technology book that you wrote. But, however, India, famous for the Vimanas, there's a lot of dolmens in India, which a lot of people aren't aware of. And if you ask me on a good day, I'll try and rationalize my best, and I'll say, yeah, we built the megaliths. Yes, there may have been giants, or there may have been some strong people. But then you get me on another day, and I'll say, no, some of these dolmens are too big. They had to be anti-gravity lifted. So in kind of coming back to India, there's a lot of megaliths in India that people just ignore or don't know about. Maybe tie in with the megaliths in India, and then we could maybe expand from there, David.
Well, sure. And India is such a fantastic country. India is really like Europe. It's not one country. It's a collection of different countries. And all over India are fantastic megaliths. The country is just so populated, and most megalithic sites are still used, and they're temples and things like that. Throughout, when you go to, say, Egypt, and I know that you were in Egypt, I guess a year ago or so, and I mean, it's just amazing. You're walking through all of these giant megalithic buildings. They're so well made. Granite statues that are highly polished. Christopher Dunn, my friend, who's an engineer. I mean, he maintains, as I do, and Stephen Mailer, that the Egyptians and many of these ancient civilizations had to have what we would call power tools, even diamond saws, in order, and I mean, not just power tools to cut these things, but they had to have some kind of technology, like we were talking about in Amadal, where they're able to easily move these 100-ton, even 1,000-ton, blocks of stone, like you have at Baalbek. Other parts of Egypt will have this too. The obelisks are also another mystery right there, where they're weighing 100 tons to 200 tons. I've just come back from Ethiopia, actually, where there's a 400-ton obelisk there that's fallen down. It's gigantically huge. And the whole thing, when you see megaliths, and whether it's Stonehenge or the Avery or the Devil's Arrows in Yorkshire, and those are pretty impressive too. But I mean, many of the other megaliths in other parts of the world are much bigger. And when we see them, our natural reaction is wow, how much effort it would have been to move these stones, to stack them up, to do all this. I mean, it just seems like tremendous amount of work. And then, of course, we imagine thousands of people dragging, hauling ropes to drag this huge stone someplace. But as you start to really see these megaliths around the world, what you start to see, and what I think, is that it couldn't have been so hard for them. And that's one of the reasons they did it, is that it was easy to do it. It didn't require all of this tremendous effort and muscle power. They were able to turn these stones weightless somehow and move them effortlessly.
They did it because
only
they
have
could.
Been like that in some cases, like particularly the stones at Baalbek in Lebanon.
Sure.
They weigh 1,000 tons.
They did it because they could, David. They did it because they could. They did it because it was easy.
That's right. And that's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, they didn't do it because it was so incredibly difficult. They did it because it was easy for them. And when you can move giant stones around and stack them up into huge walls, that's actually easier and more efficient than trying to build with small stones or small bricks or something. This is the other thing that you see in Egypt and India and South America and stuff. When these ancient people, these megalith builders built stuff, they made it to last for thousands of years, and they're still standing. Sure. I mean, in some ways, these buildings are indestructible. Sure. I mean, we don't make buildings like that today. I mean, even some of the buildings in London or Washington, D.C. are fairly well made, and some of the monuments, but they're not made to last for 3,000 years. But these buildings in Egypt, they were made that way.
I think
200
years is the limit on a modern building, David. That's all they make them for, 200 years. That's
right, and even like cars have built-in planned obsolescence. They actually want them to fail after a certain time period, so that you'll have to go out and buy a new one.
On the Vimanas, David, I can accept Vimanas. When you give me the megalithic history of the world, I can accept Vimanas very easier because, let me give you the best example, I think, for listeners on the radio. And this ties in with your Peru and Bolivia book, Ancient Technology in Peru and Bolivia. You talk about Ollantaytambo. And Ollantaytambo is probably the best example of a Vimana being used to make a megalithic wall, because these stones came from the other mountain, David. Let's talk about this one. This is the most mind-blowing megalithic mystery, I think.
Yeah, those giant blocks at Ollantaytambo, and I discuss them at length in my book. Yeah, I mean, they're 200-ton, blocks of granite. And I've been to the quarry. The quarry is on a mountain across the river. And they even built these roads to move the giant megaliths. They would quarry them on top of this mountain at a big rock slide. and they would turn them into really like a truck-sized rectangle of granite and squared and dressed, and then they would move it down the mountain, and along this road there are what they call the lazy stones, and you see megalithic blocks that have been cut and dressed just sitting there, and they never made it to the construction site of Ollantaytambo. And you wonder why that was. Why, what was it lazy about it? Why wouldn't they, they're just dragging these stones around. Why didn't they just, keep dragging this one? But for some blocks couldn't make it. I mean, that's strange. And on top of that, they had to then take them over this river, a raging river. And archaeologists cannot figure that out, how they would do it. I mean, that's a weird thing about a lot of the megaliths in South America, is that they're said, like Ollantaytambo or Machu Picchu or Sacsayhuaman there at Cusco, they're saying that, yeah, the Incas built all this stuff just prior to the Spanish invasion. And in fact, they're saying that Machu Picchu was, only about 200 years old, or less by the time the Spanish got there. So now you have the Incas who allegedly didn't even know the wheel. They didn't have writing. They didn't know the wheel. And yet, like what we were talking about, they're, for whatever reason, wanting to move giant blocks of stone around. I mean, and why would that be? Because it was so hard for them? And as I point out in my book, it's absolutely clear that the Incas did not build those cities. Mm-hmm. They inhabited them. Just like today, if you go into downtown Cusco, there are megalithic buildings there, and they're shops and restaurants, and some are
Sure.
hotels now. They're megalithic construction. Well, the people living in those buildings now are a bunch of Spanish people. They didn't build those buildings. They were already there. Yeah. And they're indestructible. And the way they're built with these interlocking granite blocks and stuff, they're basically indestructible too. Spanish buildings will get destroyed in the many earthquakes in the Andes, but those megalithic buildings, because the blocks in general are locked in, they resist these strong earthquakes that happen every year in the Andes.
When I was in Cusco, David, I used to look at the other tourists just for a giggle. I would just sit there and watch the mystery in their face as they would look at these walls, and they would touch them and they would look at the cracks in the joints. And they're just scratching their heads at how these walls were made. Such polygonal shapes, all interlocking like the biggest jigsaw you could ever try and fit together.
Well, that's right. And some of those jigsaw blocks, like at Sacsayhuaman, are huge. I mean, they're weighing 50, 80, 100 tons. And archaeologists and engineers cannot really explain how they would have such perfect fitting of these jigsaw things. And the way they have to explain it is that the stonemasons would have had to go through this incredibly tedious process of putting, the block up against another block and chipping it away. I mean, and they're perfect to make it fit to this other block. Mm-hmm. And in order to get that perfect fit, they would have had to keep putting it into place, taking it back, putting it back into place, adjusting it a little bit. I mean, it just... And we're not just talking about a 500-pound rock. We're talking about one that weighs 20, 50 tons.
Mm-hmm. David, we're just at the top of the hour. I want you to just take a moment to give us out your website for yourself as an author and the publishing as well, please, David.
Right. We have our publishing company, and we import books and sell all kinds of oddball and interesting books and DVDs. And that's our website at adventuresunlimitedpress.com. And it's basically a store. You'll see my books there and others. We have our magazine and kind of Adventure Explorers Club. It's called World Explorer Magazine, and we call ourselves the World Explorers Club. And that website, you can reach it from our book site, but it has its own site. It's called wexclub.com. Not Sex Club, but Wex Club.
Wex, W-E-X, yeah.
Wex Club, yeah. So we talk about Wex. And I have my own personal site that's called davidhatcherchildress.com.
Wow, fascinating, David. David, you know, when I was at Sacsayhuaman, there's a long zigzag wall that we were just talking about, but across from that, there's this strange rock. Looks almost like it was laser cut. You could almost see your reflection in it, and it looks like steps. Let's talk about this. I think this is just the best example of advanced high technology.
I think you're talking about that area, well, with that slide where it's all smooth and you kind of slide down the rocks, and it's all glassy. That's a strange little spot, and it's like the rock has been melted there and smoothed over. There was an article that was in Nexus magazine a couple of years ago, and it was written by a couple of Dutch guys, where they were looking at some of the stones around Cusco, and that they were doing some special kind of testing of the shininess of the stones, and what they were also saying was that the stones had this very thin, glassy glaze over them, as if the stones had been melted at one point, and that's an interesting idea, where, for instance, in the one of the later Star Wars movies, where Liam Neeson is Jedi Knight, and they're trapped in this room on a space station, and they have their lightsabers, and the way they get out of the room is he suddenly thrusts his lightsaber into this vault door and begins melting it with his lightsaber. And then this metal door of like a vault melts, and then they're able to escape from this room. And you wonder if something like that hasn't been used in some of these sites where you have, again, a kind of a plasma gun, and that's what the lightsabers are too. They're basically a Tesla sort of plasma weapon that's been bent back on itself, back into the handle, so that it's like a light sword. But it's that kind of a device that could be used to melt stone and to even shape and cut stone. Another idea of cutting some of these stones is a device that's called I think it's called a water cutter. You have to have special tips, but it's a sand slurry mixed with water that is forced out of like a wand.
High speed,
A very high speed, and it's water, and then you have to have like diamond particles or sand. The nozzle of these things has to be made out of like rubies or diamonds because it has to be super hard. But these kind of these water cannon cutters can just slice and dice, granite rock with just magically, in a sense. And quarries are just now beginning to use that kind of technology. I mean, I'm a believer, really, that any technology that we have today, the ancients could have had that technology, and certainly extraterrestrials would have it.
You know, David, you're talking about lightsabers here. I remember going from Zone X, which is above Sacsayhuaman, and when you walk from Zone X down to Sacsayhuaman, both sit above Cusco. There's these strange cubes of natural rock sticking out of the ground, and it's like somebody walked through the valley with a lightsaber and just cut little squares out of these rocks in the most strangest, bizarre form.
Exactly. No, I mean, that's a good point. Yes, you walk around Kenko and other parts there like Sacsayhuaman, it's like somebody with a very powerful melting cutting tool would just doodling,
Yes.
And they would just cut stones, and again, because it was easy for them.
Practicing or doodling or experimenting with their newfound lightsaber. It's
that's
bizarre.
right. Yeah, right. There's a famous one of the Olmec colossal heads. There's 20 of them, and they're made out of basalt too. One of those, and I talk about this a little bit in the Ancient Technology Peru and Bolivia, but I get into more detail in my book, The Mystery of the Olmecs. So these colossal heads, and they look like Africans, these guys, although again, archaeologists are saying, oh no, they're just some Mexican guys. But one of those has been defaced too, by this dishing tool. And after this, and these things weigh 20 tons. So after this, statue head was created, somebody came by with a power tool and began defacing it. And they made all these little dishing marks on it. And archaeologists are baffled by it because, one, they don't know why somebody would do this. They were essentially just like practicing with their tool. And each one of these little dishing marks, these little circular marks, are, perfectly the same. It's like somebody has this power grinder or something with a circular pad, and he's just practicing on this Olmec basalt head.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So same kind of thing, like you were saying at Sacsayhuaman. You have these tools, and sometimes you make really cool stuff with it, and other times you just go out and doodle and do nothing, really. Just carve up little notches in rocks and things.
I have to talk about Bolivia. I've had Chris Dunn on the show several times. Chris is a good friend as well. I love Chris's work. What a fascinating guy. And I haven't spoke to him about Bolivia. I got to mention Bolivia with you too, David. I know you've been there, and a great documentary you did there too, David, with Chris. But when you look at Bolivia, Pumapunku, Tiwanaku, what a fascinating place. This is just like, it's like Lego blocks made with high-tech machines, only these blocks are incredible.
Well, right, and those blocks at Pumapunku and Tiwanaku are so intricately articulated into these H blocks. They have all these different cuts and angles on them. They have little drill marks and things. Somebody, is with those. I mean, not only are they making these things like Lego blocks, they're kind of a standard block. They would like fit together. And it's almost like a computer, CAD design thing, and which is what they use now in the machine shops and stuff. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's just spewing out these blocks, kind of like in a factory setting. And then they fit them together, and assemble them into giant walls and things. Mm-hmm. I mean, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku are just incredible places. And it's known, the archaeologists know that they're pre-Inca. But many of the things that show they're pre-Inca, you can see those same things like the keystone cuts and clamps and stuff. You can see that at Ollantaytambo. You can see it at the Sun Temple in Cuzco. And so, really, I mean, and what I maintain in my book, Ancient Technology in Peru and Bolivia, is that the same people who built Tiwanaku and Pumapunku are the same people who built Ollantaytambo and Cuzco and Sacsayhuaman and Machu Picchu, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Again, it's so incredibly high in altitude as well. I mean, when you're up there, you're gasping for breath. There's such a lack of oxygen. I don't know how meager humans could push this stuff around like we're told.
Well, right, and you have also guys have elongated heads, of course, and you have that at Tiwanaku. What I also maintain, particularly with Tiwanaku, is that it was a mining center, and that what was going on there was washing of ores. They diverted a river there. They created a whole reservoir on top of a pyramid. It was a metallurgical center, and in fact, they had to have molten metals to pour into these clamps.
Oh yeah.
Whoever built it was it's a completely pre-designed place. Again, our archaeologists just typically have such a myopic view of these things. They look at Tiwanaku and Chavin is another site in Peru that's similar, but they look at them as just cult centers. These are just where the priests came and they did their sun rituals, and maybe they took some hallucinogenic drugs or something, and the people would come and make little offerings. But in reality, it may have been some kind of ceremonial center, but whoever's making this thing they're tremendously practical people. I mean, with engineering skills that are, super excellent. And they had to have metals. And so where are the mines? Where are the forges? Where are where's the metallurgical center that's creating the, liquid bronze and stuff like that?
And you mentioned
they never talk about that, but it's right there. That's what Tiwanaku must have been doing.
You mentioned the Keystone.
And they had all kinds of silver and gold, and they even had to have iron, all that stuff.
You mentioned the Keystone cuts, these clamps that they poured. They actually had to then, when you think about it, David, they had to have like a mobile smelting works to maneuver around to where the blocks were.
Well, that's right. I mean, not only did they have to quarry these blocks and dress them, and those blocks are incredibly articulated, as I was saying, very sharp. I mean, it's power tools that are making that. But on top of all that, yeah, they had to have charcoal. They would have to have furnaces. They would have to have the ores being brought there, maybe by boat. Mm-hmm. And then they're put into forges. They would have, like I said, they would have had to have tremendous temperatures, which you would maybe do with charcoal or something. So yeah, it's a huge industrial center that would have had, even in my mind, Vimanas, even like heavy equipment, like which we have to use so much today, bulldozers, cranes, graders, and things like that, big, heavy digging equipment. And I talk about that too in my book, which was one of my most popular books, called Technology of the Gods. Oh, and yeah. I actually discuss heavy machinery, bulldozers and graders and things like that. And there's evidence that we would have that too. The problem, which is the whole thing of a megalith building versus all the metals, the hard metals that are used in machines and heavy equipment, they're basically some kind of iron or steel, and those metals will oxidize. They won't last for a long time. Gold is indestructible. Mm-hmm. All the gold of ancient times still exists today. Mm-hmm. It's not going to rust away or dissipate or anything like that. But other metals will. They won't last for a long time. So if you park your ancient bulldozer, out in the by the barn and leave it there, it's going to be gone in 50 years or 100 years or 200 years. I mean, it'll just be a pile of red dust.
In your book, David, Ancient Technology in Peru and Bolivia, you mentioned the Sumerian connection in Bolivia. Now, this may seem like a radical idea to a lot of people. However, I think we've got a very good case for a Sumerian connection to Bolivia.
Oh, absolutely. And it's something, I mean, it's a ticking time bomb. It's a minefield for mainstream archaeologists. There is a ceramic bowl that is today in the Precious Metals Museum in La Paz, and it's called the Fuente Magna Bowl. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it was found near Tiwanaku. Bolivian archaeologists have authenticated it. It's the real deal. And in fact, it could be, because of ceramic, it could be tested to see exactly how old it is. And that bowl, the Fuente Magna Bowl, has two types of Sumerian writing on it. It has Sumerian cuneiform writing, and it also has the earlier Sumerian hieroglyphs. And it's Sumerian. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And it's in the Precious Metals Museum in La Paz. I mean, in a sense, for mainstream archaeologists, that can't exist. That bowl cannot be there in that museum. And in fact, I would say that if that bowl had been found in Peru, it would never make it to a museum. It would be suppressed. I mean, and this is, people ask me all this all the time. They say, well, why would there be cover-ups about, history? Sure. And, if they find, bones of some 10-foot giant, why would they cover that up? Blah, blah, blah. Well, there really are cover-ups of history, and that's part of the problems with history today is history isn't really what happened today. It's what we want to have happened. We want history to be politically correct, and so anyway, that bowl with the Sumerian writing in that museum, it just can't be there. But it is. And so you're not going to see a National Geographic show about that bowl, even though it's in a museum there in Bolivia. All the mainstream can do right now is ignore it. And that's what they do. They just pretend that, yeah, oh, well, we've never heard about that. We've never been to that museum. It's the main museum in all of Bolivia.
Wow.
So this is something, and so there it is. It's the in-your-face evidence that, yes, Sumerians came across the Pacific, probably, stopping in Easter Island, even, on the way there and back, Namdal, even Tonga, Tahiti, and all that. And then they would get to the coast of Peru, and what are they looking for? The reason they're doing all this is metals. They're after gold. They're after silver. They're after copper. And they found it. It's there.
David, when I was in Peru, Cusco, I heard stories of tunnels I think there's some up around Zone X, but did you get into any secret tunnels? There's talk of secret underground tunnels and caves in around Cusco, Sacsayhuaman. Have you looked into this mystery?
Oh, yeah. And I have been into some of the tunnels and things. And I do have one of the chapters in my book of Ancient Technology in Peru and Bolivia. I talk about the tunnels around Cusco. There are legends throughout South America of these vast tunnel systems around Cusco, particularly. You hear about it. There's other areas too, and around Lake Titicaca. I was in a church near Lake Titicaca where you can go down inside this vault, and there's a famous tunnel that they've kind of blocked out. You can look at it, and it's supposed to go to Cusco, which is 100 miles away. I surmise that, there's something to this. There really is some weird tunnel system going through the Andes of a sort. Part of it may have to do with ancient mining. And when you have mines and you're following some vein of gold or something like that, yeah, you're gonna create a tunnel through the earth.
For sure.
But many of these tunnels may have other purposes too. Escape tunnels, they were used. The Mayans, almost every Mayan city and pyramid area had, particularly in Guatemala, they had tunnels that went underneath the pyramids, and then you would come out someplace like about a kilometer away. And it was a way to escape the siege or the fighting and stuff like that. But there certainly is that. And that's one of the stories, that part of the gold treasure that was kept at the Temple of the Sun in Cusco was moved into this tunnel system and is beneath Sacsayhuaman somewhere.
David, at the end of the show, I got to mention Ancient Aliens. Did you ever expect Ancient Aliens to be so successful? I think it's 7 seasons now, 80 plus episodes. I think you're in most of them, David. What a fascinating, long-running show.
It has been really popular, and that's been great. No, I wouldn't have expected it to go for so long. And actually, the History Channel used Ancient Aliens to promote a second channel, which they call History 2 in the United States. And they moved Ancient Aliens to that channel because it was such a popular show. They were basically forcing people to start watching this other channel. But it's been great, and it's a fun show to do. They do a very good job of it, Prometheus Entertainment, and I hope it goes for more years to come.
What's new for you now, David, before we wrap up? Where are you at today? Any interesting projects you're working on? A new book, perhaps?
Well, I just came back from Ethiopia and had a great trip. That is a fantastic country and has a lot of megaliths and weird stuff in it. I was at Ark of the Covenant, supposedly, is there. I'm up to Colombia, actually.
Wow,
and
really?
And later to Brazil. So yeah, I'll be in the beginning of the new year, be heading back down to South America for a little while.
Wow, wonderful. David, I know it's the holiday season. I really thank you for taking time out for the show today. It's been much appreciated. Megaliths and Mysteries. You got to check out davidhatcherchildress.com, adventureunlimitedpress.com, and the World Explorers magazine as well. David, I really thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure. Same basalt columns, a very mysterious looking rock formation. But yeah, please continue.
Basalt is extremely hard, but it will, as it cools, it crystallizes into, or it can anyway, into these like 8-sided sort of crystalline logs, and they can be split off from cliffs, and they become what is almost like a pre-dressed stone, because it's got smooth sides and angles. And then what you can do with these logs, which can weigh up to 50 tons or more, 80 tons even.
Mm.
Most of them probably weigh 2 to 5 tons or so. And they're magnetic. Basalt's extremely hard, but then you can stack them up in what we call in the United States a Lincoln log fashion, like kind of building a log cabin.
Sure.
Only you're doing it with these long, heavy, and very hard basalt kind of logs, in a sense. And that is what Namedal is made of. And in fact, archaeologists estimate that there's over 200 million tons
Wow.
of basalt that's built up into huge walls. Some of the walls are 20 to 30 feet high. Much of the city is underwater. The city itself is not even built on the land of the island. It's built onto a coral reef that's on the southeast side of the island.
Wow.
The natives say that the basalt at Namedal was magically flown through the air by these two magicians who were brothers, and they came to the island, identified that they wanted to build this city, and then began dismantling our entire mountain it would be. And in fact, archaeologists don't really know where all this basalt came from to build Namedal. Over 200 million tons of basalt. It's such an amazing series, yeah.
Wow.
And those books are regional. There's one, and they were published in the 80s and the 90s, Lost Cities and Ancient Mysteries of South America. There's one about Lost Cities and Ancient Mysteries of Africa and Arabia, one on Asia, one on Pacific Islands, and ultimately my last book in the Lost Cities series was about Lost Cities and Ancient Mysteries of the American Southwest and parts of Mexico, which is where I live today. I live in Arizona.
Beautiful part of the world, David. Beautiful part of the world. I think what I like about your work, David, is you're one of the first people to talk about Namedal and bring it. You did a lot of press for that, David. Tell us a little bit about Namedal, because not a lot of people have ventured there. It's a very, very remote place, full of mystery, incredibly megalithic construction, really vast place in terms of engineering feat. Tell us a little bit about Namedal, and I think that's the one thing that put me on the compass towards David Hatcher Childress.
Namedal is the eighth wonder of the world. And most people haven't heard of it, and it is it's a remote island, and it's difficult to get to. It's on the island of Pohnpei, which is today the capital of the Federated States of Micronesia. To get there, you have to fly from Hawaii or Guam, and then you get to this relatively small, although for Micronesia it's a pretty big island. It's a mountainous island, and on the what is the southeast side of the island, and in fact it's actually built into the ocean, is the city of Namedal, which is a city that consists of approximately 100 artificial islands that are built up with huge basalt logs, crystalline basalt, similar to what you have there at the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland. We have the exact same,
underwater, structures and other things like that. I was born in France, actually, but my parents are American, and I lived in France till I was like 3, and then my family moved back to the United States, and I grew up in the mountains of Colorado, really, and my father was a real outdoorsy guy, loved to go camping, and we went skiing and stuff and hiking, and my parents liked to travel too, which was good. So when I was younger, went to England and Stonehenge, went down to Mexico and climbed the pyramids there, and in the United States, there was a cartoon show that was very popular in the 60s called Johnny Quest, where Johnny and his pals ran around the world and searched for mysteries. And I got a good dose of those as a kid, but I really wanted to go mountain climbing. I was a technical climber when I was younger, and so I had a dual interest of wanting to go to Tibet and the Himalayas, and because I was interested and fascinated by Tibet and the mysteries and things there, but also I actually wanted to climb in the Himalayas, and I did that. Although I gave up technical climbing after a while and just began traveling all over the world. I felt I was fortunate I traveled through India and Afghanistan, even and Iran back in the mid '70s.
Wow.
Then I went to Africa, and I ended up getting a job in Sudan, as a matter of fact. And I mean, for years I was just sort of a $5 a day traveler with backpack and staying in youth hostels, and I would get jobs where I could. Ultimately, in the end, I returned to the United States after being gone for over 5 years in Asia and Africa, and then I began going to South America and Central America, and ultimately I wrote my early series of books called The Lost Cities.
Hi everybody, and welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your host James, and I'm delighted to be talking to a new guest today, Mr. David Hatcher Childress, known as the real-life Indiana Jones to many of his fans, and a captivating speaker in his own right, author and co-author of over 20 books. And he's travelled the world several times over, seeking adventure and the answers to the mysteries of mankind's pasts. You can read about David on his website, davidhatcherchildress.com. David's also a publisher of many of this genre of books. A lot of alternative historian authors are published with David, and you can catch that at Adventures Unlimited Press. And he also has the World Explorers magazine, I believe. Today we're going to talk about his latest book, Vimana, Flying Machine of the Ancients, and a little bit about the book before I bring David on. According to early Sanskrit texts, the ancients had several types of airships called Vimanas. Like the aircraft of today, Vimanas used to fly through the air from city to city to conduct aerial surveys of uncharted lands and as delivery vehicles for awesome weapons. David Hatcher Childress, popular Lost Cities author and star of the History Channel's long-running show Ancient Aliens, takes us on an astounding investigation into the tales of ancient flying machines. And if that wasn't big enough intro, let's bring on our day's guest. Hi David, welcome to Capricorn Radio.
Hey James, good to be on your show.
David, nice to have you here, and wow, what an enigmatic author you are, David. I guess to call you a mystery seeker would be an understatement, David. You've tapped into so many of the mysteries and went in pursuit of them. A lot of authors do, they don't have the time that you have spent in the field, David. You really have traveled the world several times over. Tell us a little bit about that part of your life, David. I guess that's a core component of what you do. You like to get out there and research this stuff in the field yourself.
Yeah, I love to travel, and I love archaeology and going to different places, mysterious places, megalithic cities, and I've always been interested in the unknown and the mysteries of the past, Atlantis and UFOs, psychic phenomenon, levitation, astounding amount.
The Great Pyramid,
of
David.
Rock.
The Great Pyramid is what, 6 million tons, something like that?
Sorry, what's that?
The Great Pyramid, 6 million tons, I believe, something like that.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
That may well be. Yeah, when you go to see the Great Pyramid, and I know you've been there, yeah, you're standing there looking at what looks like a giant man-made mountain of rock. And yeah, it would have like 6 million tons or something in it.
Wow.
Dan Madal is more material.
Wow.
And where it came from, I mean, they don't know. I mean, an entire mountain would be dismantled to provide that much rock. It's bizarre. Much of the city's underwater. You have to wear a mask and a snorkel or even scuba diving gear to go down and see this city.
Wow.
You have to go by boat through the city. It's like this massive port. There's another similar city on another island that's just west, actually just east of Pohnpei, an island called Kosrae.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that also has a smaller basalt city called Lelu.
Wow.
It's one of the most astonishing things, and it's mainstream archaeologists don't have a good explanation for it.
What about the locals, David? Don't they have it's a no-go area for the locals, I hear. Is that rumor?
Well, they have a lot of superstitions about the city. They believe that they'll die if they spend the night there.
Wow.
There are people who live relatively near it, and I was just there in February, actually, this year, and you know, there is a family there, and they charge a fee to then go on into this area where the city is. And again, you have to, the parts of it you can walk through or wade through these canals. Other parts you have to be in a boat. Yeah, so the natives themselves don't like going there. Though as a kids, they'll probably go as a field trip with a school or something. But they have all kinds of superstitions. They believe that there are these